So what I'm going to do today is just go over the basics of rotoscoping. I'm going to bring in a couple of pieces of footage. I'm going to mask one of them out. In doing so, I'm just going to use some of the rotoscoping tools and also a tracker as well. So I'm going to do, I'm just going to click on the viewer, press S. I'm just going to make sure that our comp is set to the right settings. I'm going to make it 25 frames per second, HD 1920 1080. And I'm going to create a read node as well, so just using tab and then read image, and then in here I've got my footage already set up, so I'm just going to bring in my movie and I can copy and paste that as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste that read node in there. Just Control C and Control V will copy and paste that. The shortcut for the rotoscope node is O on the keyboard. So I bring that in, whatever I have selected it will attach it to, and it's already set up in the right format for that. So I've got my rotoscope there. Now if I drag this into the viewer, at the moment it's just this footage here. One of the things is my finger is in the way of the viewfinder here, which is kind of annoying. So I'm going to just, first of all, just going to create a time offset to get the piece of footage that I need. So if I press tab and TI, I'm going to get time offset in there, and I'm just going to drag, I want it to start 100 frames further forward than it currently does. I'm going to copy that time offset because I'm going to need it on this comp as well. Also, what I want to do is I'm just going to use the first 50 frames. So the frame range I want is well, actually, what I'll do, frame range I want is 100 to 150. So I'm going to put in 100 to 150 in there. I'm going to do the same actually for this one as well, because this is going to be my background. 100 to 150. And I'm just going to drop this time offset in here, so you can see that the finger has gone there. Also, while I'm at it, I'll just change my frame range to 50 as well in here, because I only want it to be 50 frames long. Okay, so I'm using the first 50 frames of this read node because I'm using frames 100 to 150 for both of these read nodes. I'm using a time offset of -100, which basically brings frames 100 to 150 forward by 100 frames. So those frames are now in this 50 frames in the timeline here. And you notice that the finger has disappeared. If I didn't have that offset, I'd just be using the first 100 frames, and also because I put a hold on those so it doesn't move till 100, nothing's happening. So if you don't put the time offset in for any reason, that's the reason why nothing's happening there. If I started at frame range 1, for instance, then I would be moving. But because I've got the hold function on, and because I'm starting at frame 100, nothing happens till frame 100. So if I just go to, yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to put that time offset in. We're going to start at frame 100 to 150, and I've got my roto layer in here, and currently there's nothing happening to it because I haven't used the pen tool, so I'm going to use the pen tool here. I've got the Bezier tool by default, which is this one here, and all I have to do is just start clicking. Now if I just use single clicks and I don't drag, I'll get sharp corners like this. If I click and drag, I'll get the Bezier curves and handles, which will allow me to get smoother curves. And once I've clicked on something, I'm just holding down Alt in order to move around the scene, and I can just click on these, click and drag, click and drag. I'm just clicking and dragging on these here. Click and drag. So I'm just going to create a fairly tight mask around this bridge here, and I'm just going to zoom out. I'm just using the wheel mouse, and single clicks, not click and drags for these corners. I'm just going to put a click and drag in just to demonstrate something in a second. Click, and then go to my first key point of my first point, and it'll lock it off. So at the moment I've got my fully completed mask here. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. So if I go into add points, I can remove points as well. So if I wanted to remove this point, I can do that. But by clicking and holding it, I can change the nature of these. So I can put in cusp points, which are to basically just create a hard corner point instead of having one that's a Bezier curve. So that makes a nice hard point in there. And I can also convert them back, so I can just turn them into smooth points as well using this one. So there's various things I can do with that one. Now so far nothing's happening with this. I've only got one read node plugged in to the viewer here. So there's one thing I need to do, which is to change the pre-multiply in order for this alpha to work. So let's just check a couple of things. So if I go to pre-multiply and I go to RGBA, you'll notice that now it just cut out that bridge there, which is quite handy. So we've got that. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to place something behind this bridge. So I still want to show the background, but I just want to create a couple of layers. So this is going to be on the top layer. It's going to be something directly behind the bridge, and then we'll see the background as well. So I've got that set up, and I've got on my RGBA. Now what I can do is I'm just going to turn this off again so we can just see how well this rotoscope matches. Now if I start moving keyframes around, you'll notice that basically we have it sort of wobbles around the place. Now there's a couple of things I can do here. Well, I created this on keyframe 32. Very often when you're sort of scrubbing around the timeline, you'll leave the time indicator-y thingy, which I've totally forgotten the name of, in a random place. I left it at 32 and it created a keyframe at 32. And you can see that my spline key has gone blue at that point. That means that, say, I'm going to move the timeline along. If I move one of my points around, just using the curve tool, or using the move tool here, between these two keyframes, the rotoscope mask will move. It will deform between these 2 points. So I've keyframed it here, and I've keyframed it there. So basically, the points will remember where they are at these 2 points in time, at 32 frames and at 39 frames. And I can skip between these keys just using these handy little buttons. So I can go to the next keyframe using this one, and that will show me the first keyframe that I created, and then I can skip to the next keyframe, which showed me the next keyframe here. Now obviously I don't need this because that's kind of weird where it points out, so I'm going to delete that keyframe using the delete keyframe tool, so it just leaves me with this keyframe at 32. So the mask remembers where it is at that particular point in time. I can create more Beziers as well. I can create more masks in here if I want to, by just creating more masks, and these masks will appear down here. So if I wanted to mask out this section, for instance, I can do that. I'm not going to do that for the purposes of this, but you'll see that it creates Bezier 2 as well, incidentally. But I'm just going to delete that one. So I've got one keyframe here. Now what I can do here is I could drag select everything, and I could laboriously go from one frame to the next, dragging everything, and as I drag it will automatically create a keyframe. So you see it's created a blue keyframe there, and as the footage moves around it will, oh, there's another one where it goes off, so I'm going to move it to there. You can see it's keyframing it automatically as I move. Now that I can do that, that's one way of doing it, but for this particular shot, the shape of this bridge doesn't really change. So I can find a quicker way of doing this. Now if it was changing shape, if it was a human being and I was rotoscoping a leg, then yeah, I'd want to probably go around and mask off mask off the leg, for instance, and move the key points to follow the shape of the leg, but the shape of this bridge doesn't really change. So I'm going to delete these keys, and I'm going to I'm just going to keep my first key because that worked just as well, and I'm just going to delete those keys. So I'm going to go to frame 32, which is where I had my mask, and it worked just fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a tracker node. So I'm going to put in tab and then TR for tracker, and there's my tracker node. And I'm going to first of all I'm going to plug it into the time offset. This is really important. If I don't do that, the tracker will track the objects based on how the footage was originally brought in, which means that it won't be minus 100 frames, it'll start at 100 frames, which will look a bit strange. So if I need to plug the tracker into a time offset to make sure that the tracker is in time with the footage that we see in the viewer. Otherwise that's not going to work. So I'm just going to double click on the tracker here, and I'm going to add a track. I get a little track coming up here, and I'm going to just move this to an object which I know it's going to find easy to track, which is this shape. It's an area of high contrast. It's a fairly definite shape. I'm just going to change the scale of that so it's got plenty to bring in. It's got plenty of pattern to bring in there. And it's basically going to track this particular high contrast area, which it should do pretty effectively. So if I let's have a look. If I use the settings that we've got here, I'm at 32 frames. I want to track all the frames before 32 and all the frames after within the time range. So if I go to, so I'm just going to go to my global, see the global timeline, which is these 50 frames, and I'm just going to go back to my 32, which is where it was found this particular area of high contrast. And so at 32 frames, going to track all the frames before. So and this button here, which is track backward range, so I'm going to go from 32 to 1, and so I'm going to go OK with that, and it will track those frames, and you can see that it's tracking that particular object. And I'm going to go back to 32. I mean, I could start at the beginning and track, but this is just 32 is fine. And then I'm going to track frames, track forward range, so I'm going to track from 33 to 50. And so I've got a full track there where the tracker is moving and it's tracking that particular area of high contrast. So what I can do with this now is I've got my tracker. If I select my roto and select my Bezier curve, you can see where my keyframe is. I can just go to the next keyframe, which was at 32, and I know that because my spline key is turned up blue. There's nowhere else for it to go there. If I click back left and right, there was only one keyframe on the timeline there. Then what I can do is I can select my roto, go to transform, go to the little spline here, the animation menu, and I can go to link to tracker and then translate as offset. It's budged ever so slightly there, but I can reset that as well. So I'm just going to drag these. So I'm going to go back to my roto, go to roto there, move to the next keyframe. I'm just going to select these objects here, these points. I'm just going to move them so they line up, because they just budged ever so slightly out of the way there when I did that. Okay, there we go. But what's going to happen now is, because in my transform I connected the tracker to the roto, when I move the timeline now, you'll notice that the mask follows that wall. And if I go to the roto again and I go to pre-multiply, RGBA, just deselect those, and notice that it follows the wall around, which is very handy, which is cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I wanted to put something behind this wall, and if I'm going to go to tab and read, and I have a some files here which I'm going to bring in, which is an image sequence of a little rat thing. Just going to double click on that. I'm going to just put a pre-mult on that and just pop it into there. And I want to put, I'm going to merge this as well, so I'm going to put in tab and merge. I want the rat on the front, and I want this in the background. Now what I'm going to do is just unplug that for a second, put the merge over, and there's my little rat there. I'm going to move these in place, and I'm also going to use the transform because I want to move this rat around. He's not in the right place at the moment, so I'm going to go tab, tr, transform, just going to put that in place there so I can move and scale this rat. So I can move him to about here. Now if I then I want this, currently this rat is not going to move around when I move the keyframes here, when I move the slider, so he's going to stay where he is. So I also need to move, make sure this rat transforms as well. So I click on the transform and just do the same thing again in the transform node. So I go to translate, going to link to tracker and translate with offsets. Now it's moved ever so slightly, you can just move that back to where it was, and now the rat moves with the marker there. So he moves okay. Now I'm going to merge these two together. So if I go to tab and then ME for merge, I want this to be in the background, I want my brick wall to be in the front, in the foreground, so I can just connect those to that there. I'm just going to disconnect this for a second and then reconnect it. So that's my background. I'm just going to reorder this stuff here. I'm going to move this so that this is in the foreground. I'm going to go to... So that didn't quite work. It's because I've got them the wrong way round, so I'm going to just go back the other way. And I'm going to put A needs to be this in the foreground because this is in the foreground. B is going to be this in the background. And there I have my little rat is behind where I want it to be. So I'm just going to still move this where I want it to be. So he's playing his little flute. And I'm going to just move this timeline along. And the rat moves with the rat will move with the movement of the footage. Now if my computer wasn't so completely slow, this would be a lot faster. And then what I need to do actually so one of the things I noticed there was when I was animating this in the I noticed that I'd accidentally put a keyframe on, which you can actually spot if you go into the graph editor, into curve editor, sorry. I've got my transform node here, I've got my tracker here. Now the tracker there, these are the keyframes that I've used for my tracker. As I move my mouse around, so if I wanted to like move him say over here for instance, what I might find is as I move he starts to kind of move around a bit, and you can see up here there's these keyframes being added on it's a little bit confusing. I can see my tracker keyframes in there, but I can also see these other keyframes. So if you want to see those, you can see them in the translate graph in the curve editor. I can just drag select those and delete them. Should be able to do. Now he does move back where he originally was. All I want is just one keyframe just to move him to where he needs to be, which is about there. Now as long as I've got one keyframe, that's going to hold him where he needs to be, which is just fine. And now if I move the tracker backwards and forwards, he'll track okay with the footage. However, if I was to move another keyframe, so if I said, oh, I don't like him there, I want to move him over here, what will happen is he'll move between those keyframes, and that's not what I want, because he'll start sliding around. But if I go into the curve editor, drag select, I can delete that keyframe off the X and Y keyframe, and he'll track perfectly well, just like that. Okay, and so we have it. There's our footage. There he is. He's playing his little flute, and he's moving around the place with the tracker. So now what we need to do is just create a write node so I can turn it into a movie. Just going to drag that and pop it into there. Just going to double click on that. And just setting the settings for this one. So I've just created a MOV there, just saved it in that location by putting .mov at the end to make sure it recognizes the file type. Change the codec to H.264, and if I click render, I want it to be on the viewer time range, so 1 to 50, and then I'm just going to click OK on that one. And here's the file. It's going to move it around, so you move the time slider and it tracks pretty well there. Obviously I've missed a little bit there, I should pull him down a little bit further, but you can see that he tracks pretty well with the bridge there.